Hello, good afternoon. Hi everyone, welcome to the Asian Museum. Please find your seat. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to take my mask off for the little remarks. Otherwise, my glass tends to foggy up, and I'd like to see you. So my name is Jay Xu. I'm the director and CEO of the Asian Museum. It's such a delight to have all of you for this very, very important moment. And we're particularly happy to welcome you that after our transformation project, through the trials of many challenges, including pandemic. And our museum opened to the public, reopened to the public in March, but more recently, we opened our expanded facility just downstairs with a wonderful show, Team Lab. And also, through this transformation project, one thing that we really aim to do is to partner with organizations in our communities to grow our roots deeper in our communities. And also, to make an Asian Museum a leading platform for artists of Asian descent, Asian Americans, and immigrants of Asian diaspora. And we want to turn the museum inside out. In other words, the walls of the museums are not only the protective barrier, but also the first galleries for people to see, to experience, to interact, for us to engage our public. So for example, in the back, in the Hyde and the McAllister, we see 3 murals. On the pedestrian level, you see a mural by Filipino-American women artist Jennifer Wolford. Yeah, so great, Jennifer, just stand up, please. And oh, wonderful, wonderful. I was so happy, surprised. I did not know she's here. Everyone was wearing masks, so. And really paying homage to former generations of Asian American artists, particularly those in our own community, that had made tremendous contributions in our life, not only in the Bay Area, but in American life in general, but they remain under-recognized. And then one level up, first floor, that we feature Zanele Miller's work on the theme of healing. Our society is in high need for healing. And Zanele Miller, as the leading champion for women's rights, particularly fighting against sexual violence toward women, she's really inspiring. And one level further up, on this level, behind me, is a art terrace yet to be completed, but we have murals, art installations, already you can see from the street. And this time, it is by Indian American women artist, Jazz Charanjiva, called Boom. Again, women power and the fight against sexual violence towards women. So in doing so, the Asian Museum really want to announce its effort in partnering with community organizations. And today, we're delighted and honored to co-host this afternoon's panel with the newly formed Asian American Foundation. Wonderful, kudos and congratulations. And with us, of course, is the founding president, Sonal Shah. Sonal, thank you. And your team, welcome to the Asian Museum. And I believe today's panel is called Creative Solutions to Belongings. Again, a vital topic that affects all of us. So without further ado, let me bring our assistant curator for contemporary art, Janet Oh, who also serves as a co-host for the symposium, After Hope. So, Janet, and looking forward to chatting with you post the symposium as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jay. Welcome, everyone. I hope you had a chance to check out the After Hope exhibition downstairs. So I want to introduce Sonal Shah for the panel Creative Solutions for Belonging, co-hosted with the Asian American Foundation. Sonal Shah is the founding president of the Asian American Foundation, TAF. One of the foremost global leaders on social impact and innovation, Shah has started and led social impact efforts in academia, government, and the private and philanthropic sectors for over 25 years. So I'd like to welcome Sonal to the podium.
First of all, I want to say thank you to Jay. Thank you for your partnership. Thank you for hosting us in this beautiful space, and thank you for having us here. It's important. What you all have been doing with the Asian Art Museum is so important for our community, and it's critical because often art is the space where we see identity in ourselves, and it's important that you have, and what we have here is actually super important, so thank you. Thank you, Janet, for all the great work that you do, and thanks for introducing me. Thank you to Padma, also the assistant curator. Really appreciate you having us here. I also want to thank Jerry Yang and Akiko Yamasaki. They're not here, but Jerry's our board member, but also I know a huge patron of the Asian Art Museum and super important. There's a few other people I just want to thank and introduce here really quickly, but there's some student leaders with AAPI's Rising. They're young leaders. Stand up, please. Young high school leaders who are you guys even in high school or are you junior high? 8th graders who are just super, it's so important, and thank you for your leadership and everything that you're doing and reaching out to us. I want to introduce Nikki Fortunata Bass. She is the council president for Oakland. And she's also running Reimagining Public Safety in Oakland, which is really important. And before we get started, I also wanted to just recognize Wilma Chan, who passed away a couple of days ago, and just her incredible leadership and what she has done for both the state of California, but also in Oakland, and really just being a leader that we all have followed. So a really huge gratefulness to her. But you know, yesterday I went to the vigil, and as I was telling Julia, it's when you're at vigils you realize like the statements, the stories that were being told from the heart remind you the type of life someone led. And when someone just comes and speaks from the heart the way they did about Wilma, it just tells you the impact she had on people's lives. Sometimes we talk about big policy issues and things like that, but really the biggest impact we have is on each person's life. And to hear those stories was super important. So we will forever remember her and her leadership over the many years that she has dedicated her life. But really, as we move forward today, just to keep in mind that Wilma really sort of was a leader for the Asian American community in the Bay Area, and really appreciate everything that she's done. So with that, I am going to invite my panelists to come up. I'm going to introduce them first. But we're super excited about having this conversation because too often we don't put art and science together. We talk about it, but what we're really talking about is how do we move from hate to healing to hope to belonging? And this is sort of what we're all trying to create in the country together, and it's important that we have conversations about it, not just talk about it as a general idea, but to actually talk about the idea. And that's why, and what do we do? What are the solutions? What are creative ways that people have approached it? How might we think about solving problems in new ways? How might we think about solving problems that others may be looking at differently from the way we think about it? And what are ways that we can bring those together, that we are collectively working together to do this? So that's why I'm super excited that we are here to have this conversation at the Art Museum and in partnership with the Art Museum, but also this panel. Each person on the panel brings an incredible set of experiences and a varied set of experiences. That's why these solutions matter. So the first person I would like to introduce is Christine Wong Yap. She is an artist in residence for the city of Berkeley's Health, Housing, and Community Service. But she's also a visual artist and social practitioner. And you'll be hearing from her in just a minute. She's going to walk you through some slides, which are going to be important. But Christine, please come on up. I'd like to introduce Jose Antonio Vargas. He is an award-winning, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and has written and authored a memoir called Dear America, Notes of an Undocumented Citizen and founder of Define American. And as you will listen to him, you'll also hear the passion by which he knows and is trying to understand America and what does America, how does America look, but what are the voices that we're not including sometimes, and defining America in a different way and what it means to be American. But Jose, come on up, please. And then finally, I want to introduce Julia Liou. She's the incoming CEO of Asian Health Services. She is a partner to TAF in building the first Oakland Asian American Action Center, and they're really taking the lead in partnership with us, but really they're doing the hard work in being a community service oriented place. Not just when you have a problem do you come there, but you come for health services, you come to understand how to protect yourself, you come to understand how do you find your community and what you need. But Julia's been there for a very long time, which means she knows the community in depth, and she knows what it takes to actually deliver outcomes. So Julia, please come on up, and it's great to have you here. So I'm going to take my seat and start from there, but I'm just going to start with, we're going to start with Christine. She's going to show us some slides, and we'll start with the conversation from there, and I'll ask you questions. But Christine, do you want to get started? Oh, wait, sorry about that. I forgot about that. We have 2 videos to play, so let me just start with Senator Padilla was not able to come, but he did send us a video, and then we have a quick TAF video we'd like to play, and then with that, we'll get started.
Hi, I'm Senator Alex Padilla, and I have the honor of representing California in the United States Senate, and I'm proud to be the first Latino to do so. In California, diversity is our strength. We're home to the nation's largest immigrant population, including nearly a third of all Asian Americans. The difficulties of the past year and a half have underscored the need for representation and cultures of belonging at every level of our society. The COVID-19 pandemic caused illness, loss, and financial hardship, particularly for communities of color. At the same time, Asian Americans faced a compounded epidemic of racism and violence. But California stood strong against the racist rhetoric. We led the nation in sending a loud and clear message. We must reject and denounce all forms of anti-Asian discrimination and hate. As your senator, I'm proud to have co-sponsored the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, which was signed into law this year by President Biden, and will dedicate additional federal resources to protect AAPI communities. As a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee, I've worked to hold our federal law enforcement agencies accountable and have pushed the FBI on combating the rise of violence targeting Asian Americans. And back home, I've partnered with members of Congress, including Congressman Ted Liou, on town halls focused on addressing the rise of AAPI hate during the pandemic. I stand with you in your commitment to create cultures of belonging, and we must continue to work together to build a better future for all. Discussions like this one are critical to that project as we strive to build more inclusive communities. I'm committed to keeping up that fight in the Senate, and I want to thank the Asian American Foundation for all your work to promote equity and understanding.
So super excited. First of all, a huge thank you to Senator Padilla, and for him to really take the time and really participate. He has been, and his team has been really helpful to all of us, and we're grateful for his leadership. Julia is super grateful for your leadership on the action centers. We know it's important, and part of the reason the Asian American Foundation is making a local commitment is we recognize that we need to be present locally, not just nationally, to understand what's happening on the ground and to be partnering with communities who are already working on the ground. So we're super excited to be working with you, not only in addressing hate, but the reason we're here to talk about belonging. And how do we create a society and a community that has belonging. So Christine, in the Haas Institute magazine, you wrote, belonging often happens because of intention, investment, support, generosity, and cooperation. So Julia, let me start with you for a second. And how have you approached the conversation on belonging from Asian Health Services, but also just how you work in the community?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sonal, for having Asian Health Services on this panel, and just really such a pleasure to be on this panel with the other esteemed panelists, Jose and Christine. And Christine, we were just sharing that it's been 18 years, actually, since we last saw each other. We're going to be talking about the mural that you see up here, because that's something we did together. But just about your question about belonging, when I think about belonging, I kind of go back to what I envision the concept sort of personally. I grew up in Salt Lake City, Utah. I'm the daughter of immigrants from Taiwan and Hong Kong. And in Salt Lake City, Utah, not too many Asians there. My next door neighbor was Asian. She was Japanese American. Everyone thought we were twins, even though we looked nothing alike. And so really just experienced, microaggressions, discrimination. But I think, from that, feeling different, I had the opportunity to go to college out of state, to Boston, Massachusetts at Wellesley, where I was able to be surrounded by others who looked like me, who were Asians, other students of color, and it was such a rich diversity, really made me understand what it meant to feel in a belonging situation. But I think really it was when I joined Asian Health Services nearly 20 years ago that it really brought me to sort of my full sense of belonging. Asian Health Services is a community health center that has been around for over 4 decades, actually 47 years to be exact. And our health center provides medical, dental, behavioral health care services in 14 languages, of which 12 of them are Asian languages. We provide these services to 50,000 patients. The majority live at poverty level. They speak limited English. They're immigrants and refugees. They are children, they're teens, they're families, they're our elders. And so really what's a grounding principle for Asian Health Services is that when we think about what our measure of success is, it really isn't about the number of patients that we serve. It's really about how many are empowered to assert their right to health care. And that's what belonging means, and for us. And so I think that overall, when we think about belonging, we think about how for our patients, how can we bring our patients to be their full selves? How can we allow them and help them reach their highest potential, their health potential, and really so that we can elevate their voices so that they can articulate what are their needs, and not only what their needs are, but what they deserve. So I think all in this context, when we approach our advocacy initiatives, when we approach our programming, when we approach our services, we really think about sort of a larger context. And I think the larger context also has to involve what isn't belonging, and that is being othered. And I think that we've all probably have felt othered at some point. I think that our patients and our community members have actually felt that even more acutely as low-income immigrants and refugees. And so I think it's with that where they have been othered because they have been unable to access services because of the language they speak. They're not able to be understood because of their culture or because of what's being portrayed as immigrants in the media, those icons and the projections of what they are, but it's not really a reflection of who they are. So I think overall, when we think about the services we provide, it is about the services in their language. It's about making sure that the cultural beliefs of our Laotian patients, of our Mongolian patients, our Burmese patients, our Chinese, our Vietnamese, Korean patients, that they feel that they're understood because of their cultural beliefs and where they came from, and that they're embraced for that. So last, I just want to say that it is important, especially as we've entered into this period of anti-Asian hate, that it's been extremely important to really understand the structural racism that has created a lot of these sort of marginalized spaces, because we have to recognize that in order to address it. And so in that way, it is our mission to really create a greater shared identity, to bring our histories together, and really to make sure that the dominant narrative is not causing us to be juxtaposed and against each other.
So critical, and just important to remember that it's easier to divide, but the hard part is working together to bring people together. And thank you for all that you do. Jose, you know what it means to be othered. You live in this, this is what Define American is trying to do. And tell us what belonging means to you.
Well, first of all, I'm really happy to be here. This is my first event publicly since the pandemic started, and I'm happy to do it here. I'm a proud product of the Bay Area. Went to San Francisco State when it was affordable. And I used to be a reporter at the Chronicle, and I have this distinct memory of same-sex marriage happening just across the block, right, at City Hall. And as someone who's gay, I remember how that was a moment of belonging, right? So when I think about belonging, I think the question I ask myself is, what are the conditions of belonging, right? And at Define American, one of the things for us is, what does representation look like, right? I mean, you hear a lot about representations, mattering, but what kind of representation exactly, right? And so, as someone who's undocumented and gay and Filipino, the conditions of belonging has been kind of fighting the narratives that are dominant about those three things, right? So the big part of what we do at Define American is, how do we look at narrative systems all across media? Because the reality is, we live at a time in which when you see somebody, it's not just as if they're just consuming, listening to NPR or reading the Chronicle. You're dealing with somebody who's watching YouTube videos, like anti-immigrant YouTube videos, right? Or TikTok videos, right? Or someone who's consuming a television show that perpetuates the model minority myth, right? Or the fact that when people think of undocumented immigrants, they usually think of Latinx immigrants, even though the fastest growing undocumented population is actually coming from Asia. So the work that we do is, how do we get granular about this? So as it happened actually today, Define American, we have an entertainment media advocacy team, and my colleague who runs it is sitting right there. Charlene, can you just wave? Charlene Jimenez runs it. She's wonderful. And today is a big deal for us. So we just launched our reference guide, Telling Authentic Immigrant Stories. Variety, the industry trade in Hollywood, released it today exclusively. And basically, this is a 22-page guide for every writer, producer, director who's making television and film, and telling them how should immigrants, AAPI immigrants, Black immigrants, who often gets left out of the conversation, Latinx immigrants, and by the way, immigrants who are also facing climate displacement, right? And for us, whenever you think about storytelling or narrative change, it can get really abstract. So I think the journalist in me is always looking for how do we know that we know what we know, right? And how do we measure that, right? So for example, we've been partnering with the Norman Lear Center at USC to release research on this very issue. And we found last year, actually, our report came out after we studied all of these television shows. This is the golden age of television because of all the streaming, right? We studied all the television shows, and we found that Asian immigrants, AAPI immigrants, were grossly underrepresented. They made up 12%, right, of all of these shows, network, streaming, when in reality, right, 25, 27% of immigrants in this country are actually AAPI, right? So what does that mean when it comes to, not only when it comes to how we're represented as immigrants, but what kind of immigrants? What are the actual narratives that are perpetuated when we see these characters, right, or storylines? And the work actually started with Superstore. I don't know if you're familiar with a show on NBC called Superstore, right? That was on TV for 6 years. They decided that they were going to have an undocumented gay character, this guy named Mateo. And the producer said, oh, we actually read Jose's story, so we're going to make this character. And then they said that, oh, we'll make the character legal by the end of the season. And we're like, wait, how are you going to do that? Are you just going to automatically pass immigration reform? They didn't know. These are all well-meaning people. This is right after when Trump was elected. So we actually sent undocumented people to the writer's room of the show to inform them on, wait, this is what it looks like, this is the diversity of the issue, this is the process. So now we've done that on more than 100 television shows and films, Grey's Anatomy. I remember actually the first show I visited was Blind Spot on NBC. And I convinced them, I said, hey, like, because they were gonna do this undocumented character and she was gonna be Latina. And I said, can she be Indian? Because, you know, like there's a lot of undocumented Indian people out there. They didn't know that, right? So like our job is to just show the diversity of the communities that we're dealing with. And I'm just proud that we've gotten to that point now where we're actually saying, so once you see a character, how does that change your behavior, right? So that's the kind of rigor that we're looking into this work. So we found that the more exposed you are to a character on TV, the more likely you are to actually act on their behalf. Now, people forget this because we live in this bubble that is the Bay Area, right? The great majority, 75% of Americans live in predominantly white towns. I don't know if you all knew that. So meaning the moment they encounter immigrants is the media they consume. So that's why we got to get really specific about, well, where are they getting that information from? So for us, when it comes to belonging, it's about representation at the level of that representation. And I started the conversation by talking about the LGBTQ movement because, look, it's not perfect. Like how we deal with LGBTQ, especially with trans people, is still not there. But the reality is you cannot change the politics of the LGBTQ issue unless you change the culture in which LGBTQ people were seen. Right? So meaning Gavin Newsom couldn't do what he did if Ellen DeGeneres hadn't come out on the cover of Time magazine, if Will and Grace wasn't the #1 show on television, if Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, the first version, not the Netflix one, right, wasn't already a hit on Bravo. So in that same way, that's what we're doing. This is a little trickier because we're dealing about race and we're dealing about class, right? And what, you know, James Baldwin would call the United States of amnesia, where we live in a country that unless you're Native American or African American, you're an immigrant, but yet this is something that a lot of people seem to forget, right? So that's what we do. And I'm just glad, though, to be part of a panel, because I think more than anything, we need creative solutions. We need to get as creative as we possibly can, and as much as possible, seek for being specific. So changing the narrative is not enough. What narrative are you changing? How are you changing it? How are you measuring that? So that's kind of what we're hoping to do.
Thank you. Well, we have a lot to dig in this panel. So, Christine, I'm going to turn it to you. And this is something I read a quote from you in terms of, you know, belonging often happens because of intention, investment, support, generosity, and cooperation. How do you think about belonging?
I'm happy to share. I have some images, but Julie, do you want to just mention what this mural is about before we hop ahead?
Yeah.
Wait, do you want to mention about what this mural is about, or do you want me to explain? Oh, okay. All right. Let's see. Okay. So I'm sorry. I got to skip to my slides. All right. So I approach belonging through my work as a visual artist and social practitioner, and I'm greatly influenced by positive psychology, which is an empirical subset of psychology that looks at what people do to maintain or increase their subjective well-being. My goals as an artist is to research, experiment, and contribute new knowledge. And one of the areas I like to research is actually about belonging. So I've done a couple different projects where I ask people about belonging. So I partner with some community-based organizations, and I've asked questions such as, where do you feel a sense of belonging? What contributed to that sense? What are systems, structures, policies, or practices that support your sense of belonging? And influenced by Brené Brown, do you carry your sense of belonging with you? And then I've taken those responses and created some artwork, such as what you see here, which is a hand-painted sign installed on site in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I've also done projects where I hand letter certificates and install them at places of belonging. And to commemorate people's sense of carried belonging, I've designed and screen printed a series of bandanas. And I've taken people's stories and compiled them into books, zines, and comic books. This is a book of 100 stories of real people's stories of belonging. And the goal is to capture and disseminate those stories of belonging. So my interest at first was actually about the feeling of belonging. And I was thinking a lot about if somebody who might not know you or anything about you tells you that you don't belong through messages or policies, what inside of yourself might be able to resist that? Like if you know Thursdays at 3 o'clock when your soccer club meets, you have a real definite feeling of belonging. How might you map those places where you feel belonging in those times and kind of like forge a network where in your neighborhood or in your city, you have a real sense that you belong, whether or not somebody is telling you that you don't. I think reflecting on those places of belonging can help people recognize the role of belonging in their lives. I think commemorating those places can help kind of close a circle of gratitude to show people how much their work in maintaining a space of belonging means to people. And I think by recognizing that places of belonging surround us, that we can also be inspired to think about how we create belonging for others around us. But through this work, one of the things I've really started to think a lot about is how belonging is a lens, and how any manner of things, whether it's psychological, social, or political, can be viewed through a lens of belonging. And I really love thinking about it through the public health lens. And for me, coming from the mental health perspective, like so much of mental health outcomes are tied to medical health outcomes and mortality and public health outcomes.
Thank you. I mean, what each of you brings to this is such an important perspective. And I think, Julia, you talked a little bit about the work you're doing in Oakland, and not just in creating the space in public health for belonging, but and through the health services, but also what you're doing with the community around you and making sure that there's connectivity and belonging. So I'd love for you to talk about a little bit about how are you thinking about creative solutions and art in how you bring the community together, and what are ways that you've done that through Asian Health Services? Because these are not two things that you would put in the same sentence: art, public health, and Asian Health Services, right? But you've done that, so I'd love for you to talk about it a little bit and why it's been important to you.
And maybe Christine, I'm going to go back to the slides. So as Sonal said, Asian Health Services, we have really approached a lot of our work within a public health framework, especially given this pandemic that we've been in, and actually this dual pandemic of both COVID and anti-Asian racism. And so I think with that lens, we've really looked at our issues through kind of a social, it's called social determinants of health, just looking at the factors of health. Environmental, political, economical, all these factors. And so, again, was so excited to be on this panel because Christine, 18 years ago, we worked together on this mural that you see up here. And so this is in Oakland, Chinatown, in Pacific Renaissance Plaza, and I have to call out Mike Locke because he was one of the youth who actually worked on this mural. Just to give you a little bit of context for this, one of our board members' fathers was actually killed at the intersection where one of our flagship clinic sites is located in Oakland, Chinatown. It was a very busy street. He was, crossing the intersection, and an Isuzu trooper hit him, and he passed away. And it, reminds me just, Sonal, you were talking about, Supervisor Wilma Chan, a similar incident happened to her very recently. But, all to say that when this occurred, I think we were in shock. And I think when we heard about this, it was, wow, this was our board member's father who was killed. He was 81 years old. He was carrying his groceries across the street. And so when we actually looked into this issue a little bit further, we started to peel away the layers. And the layers were that Oakland Chinatown had the highest concentration of pedestrian accidents, injuries, and deaths. And then you took a little bit of a step back further. The city of Oakland had the highest number of pedestrian accident deaths in the state. So I think it was at that point we recognized that there was this issue, And we mobilized our youth and really had a vision around how do we create a dialogue about this? What's going on? And so when we had the youth look into this, we began to recognize that there was actually a structural racist history to all of this. Because when you looked at how Chinatown had been planned, Chinatown was actually the victim of poor planning. And you had freeways that were built around Chinatown. There were arterial streets that were literally freeway ramps to our neighboring cities. And it was because our community didn't even know about what was happening, didn't even have a voice in this process. And so this was actually creating, it was the structural environment that was creating this environment of a very unsafe pedestrian environment. And so when our youth gathered together and got all the data, you know, we had a fact sheet, but I think at that time, I really felt like we needed to really speak to this issue in a very different way. And so talking to Christine and, you know, being this muralist and doing art within the community, it was about how do we really evoke a story? How do we tell this story in a very different way? And it was really creating this intergenerational dialogue. It was about how do we evoke sort of this sense of trauma that happened and being able to process it, but also being able to provoke actually a reaction as well. So we would bring this mural, which is a mobile mural, everywhere we went. We brought this to city council meetings. And you know, it was just such a very different form of testimony. It was the youth who had envisioned themselves in this mural. It was Mr. Hong Yi. It was all about Chinatown. And it was just a visual story. And I think it was so impactful. And I remember our city council member who saw this and said, we need to do something about this. We have statistics that are showing that we have a lot of these deaths and injuries that are disproportionate in our community. And so really it was, again, sort of this ability for us to create a different platform. We brought this to schools, we hung it in the library, and again, it was being about an ability to evoke a conversation. It was a way to pique people's curiosity and just, what is this about? And so just having that dialogue. But again, it just created a vehicle for us to be able to advocate for what we actually wanted to see in the community. This is just a kind of clearer version of this. And I don't know, Christine, if you remember, I mean, all the youth who came together to put this together. And so really what happened was, as a result of that, being able to really drum up that dialogue, really think about what were the solutions coming from the community, we were able to organize town halls. And again, this mural was sort of a centerpiece as we did all this. And the community said, hey, we actually need some really concrete, again, solutions. And so we worked with the city engineers and with our city council and came up with this four-way crosswalk. And the four-way crosswalk was really, really critical because it provided a pedestrian-only phase. And it would not allow any cars to be occurring during, when pedestrians were crossing the street. And I think what was really relevant at that time was making sure, how was this being represented? So it was an opportunity to also create identity for our community. And so when we actually asked the community, what do you want to represent Chinatown? San Francisco has, a gate, Chicago, Chinatown has gates, but what was Oakland Chinatown's identity? And so what you see here is this four-way crosswalk. This is a Qing Dynasty pattern. And so I think it was just a way that people could feel like this is our community, this is what represents us. It was really about evoking the heart of our community. And we worked with BART. We actually worked on signage that was wayfinding signage, so it was a win-win. It was for us to be able to have an identity. We have a Qiling, so whenever you come to Oakland Chinatown, you'll see some signage. That's a Qiling. It's a good luck animal in both Chinese and Vietnamese communities. And for BART, it was a win because they wanted to be able to tell people where our, BART stations were located, because Chinatown was nestled in between these two BART stations. So I think all to say, it was just, again, using art and creative solutions to really bring together policy changes and concrete changes so that our community could actually see. You know, during the anti-Asian hate, and again, you know, these episodes have always been there and continued, but when it really started to erupt, and Oakland Chinatown really was part of ground zero at that time, we had boards up around our clinic, but we brought out our staff, where we were able to put art into action. I think it was really a process of taking the sort of fear and some of the frustration and also anger, and being able to have just a transformative way for us to be able to, again, be together and to be able to visualize and transform, you know, again, all of this trauma that we were feeling into a type of action. And we started to see that throughout Oakland Chinatown. There were all of these murals that were coming about Black Lives Matter. We have so many just beautiful murals that came up that really spoke to, you know, our Asian identity, and really what were we feeling at that time. And I just want to kind of end with, you know, when the last administration came out with the executive order on public charge, and I do want to recognize, I think, our incoming president, Tu Quach, she worked very hard to mobilize so many comments to oppose public charge with Mike and all of our teams. And, you know, one big part of it was really mobilizing a huge rally to really speak out and hear voices around opposing public charge. Public charge was a threat and created a lot of fear among our patients, because they thought, I could lose my green card, I could be deported if I use Asian Health Services medical care. And so really it was this moment, and you see this beautiful imagery of origami. So our very close partners, the Oakland Buddhist Church and Asian Prisoner Support Committee, really through their Roots program at San Quentin, were able to fold these beautiful 3,000 origami cranes. And I think it was really just a symbol, again, visual symbol of hope. And so I think that, again, art is such an important way for us to build community. As an important tool to be able to bring us together and really, again, sort of create this pathway of both helping us to heal, but also pathway for us to envision what hope looks like.
Wow, these are beautiful images. And I think what's important, Jose, you talked about having specific data of what you wanted to change, and I think Julia gave us a very specific approach as to the way they took it. But art evokes emotion, and it evokes a way for us to respond to things and brings a community together, which is, I think, Julia, what you're showing, and the way you used art to bring the community together. And Christine, your work transforms experiences, trauma, crisis, scarcity into opportunities to focus on resilience and belonging. That is your artwork, and that is what you focus on. What have you learned in doing the work that you're doing, and what are we doing that we may be getting overlooked because we're not thinking about this? So we'd love your thoughts on this.
Okay, great, thank you. I have more images, actually, so let me just skip ahead. So I love mentioning the idea of feelings, because like I said, I think when we're lucky, belonging can be implicit, because we don't have to think about it. We know when we feel that we belong. But when there's times of rapid change, as John Powell from the Othering and Belonging Institute explained, that's when othering and issues of belonging become more explicit. I think for me, I really like to focus on belonging as part of the thing about positive psychology, that understanding it's not about being a pessimist or a realist. It's actually the positive is just as real as the negative. And so when we focus on belonging, it can help us have more of an asset focus and more of a growth mindset. It can help us understand a community, not just what it needs, but also what its existing assets are. So in one of the projects I did, I partnered with the Chinese Culture Center of San Francisco, and we asked the community, how does arts and culture impact your sense of belonging? And because the Chinatown community is immigrants, they tend to be older or younger, I wanted to create a book that was a little bit more accessible to people. So we made a 56-page comic book that's fully bilingual, and that's what you see here. And I learned a lot of things about this project, through this project. Sorry, I'm gonna skip ahead. One of them is basically that Chinatown is like a memory palace that you can walk through. Like the mnemonic devices are these multi-sensory things that you encounter as you're just walking down the street. It could be baked goods, it could be the sound when you pass by a dim sum place, it could be any number of things. And the memory palace is kind of like a vessel for intergenerational family histories. And I realized, like, in many ways, Chinatown, which is actually like the densest neighborhood outside of Manhattan within the US, it's actually a model for urbanism because it's so alive with culture. And I realized like a lot of artists are asked to work in public spaces to do projects that are about creative place making. But I realized with this project, it's about creative place knowing. And I hope by kind of creating these documents about the rich cultural assets and the individual narratives, it's kind of like returning them to the collective imagination. So one thing I'll say about the feeling part is, you know, anytime there's an incident of anti-Asian violence, it is so disheartening. And it feels like it's robbing you of your faith in humanity. And I've heard from people who have experienced incidents and they start to question themselves, like, do I belong here? Do I have the right to be who I am? And I think the opposite of a disheartening is to focus on the heartening, right? So what is it that heartens? And I think bearing witness to belonging and also knowing like it doesn't have to be a huge gesture. It could be small, quiet moments. And these moments can be pervasive because they're happening all the time. They're happening right now with people buying groceries on Stockton Street, or maybe just waiting on the street corner and hearing a dialect that sounds like home. So I think even though this affective stuff may not lead to systems change in and of themselves, it reinforces your sense of self, your identity, your sense of community, and I think these are things that nurture our resilience, and they enable us to sustain working towards belonging.
Yeah, it's so important. You know, I was thinking as you were showing the comic book picture of all the different sights and sounds and feelings when you walk into a Chinatown and how you feel when you're there. You don't always think about it. It's not, you don't think about it intellectually. You think about everything that you smell, everything you feel, the people you see, and it's so important to remember that because sometimes it's easy to intellectualize. So, Jose, I'm going to take this to you, and this is going to be your last. It's going to be our last question because we're running out of time. The museum closes at 5, so I want to make sure we can get to this. But I think that you know, it's easy to put the Asian American and AAPI communities, start with where you started, into a box. Yeah. You are a type of community like this. And either it can be defined in the Chinatown or it can be defined in the version of you're the model minority myth. And we're everywhere in between, right? I mean, we are a community that belongs everywhere in between. And this last election, if you just watch this past election, our community was not monolithic. In fact, I think when we look at the data, it's weird. We have our own perspectives, we have our views. How do you read that? How do you read what's happening? How do you read sort of what does that say, and what should we be taking away as you think about yourself as a storyteller? What should we be taking away from that?
Thank you for that question. And we were texting about this because I was, you know, like, how do you reconcile, you know, the first Asian American mayor of Boston, also the first woman of color, and at the same time, the fact that the Virginia governor got elected governor because of because of some Asian American voters, right? And this is where I think the moment that we're in right now is the fact that we paint these broad strokes about people of color and about the Asian American community. With the work that we do, we're very audience-oriented, meaning how do we not make assumptions about people's opinion on something just because of their identity, right? And if anybody who is Filipino, the amount of work I've had to do with my Filipino relatives just to not vote a certain way, that is hard. I've been on the O'Reilly Factor, I've talked to Megyn Kelly, like, going on Fox News is a lot easier than confronting some of my racist relatives about what they think about not only specific other people, but even within the Asian community. And this is where I actually really want to credit TAF, because I think you all have been very intentional about being pan-Asian, right? And as someone who's Filipino, sometimes Filipinos and Indians get left out of the AAPI conversation, right? And so I think that kind of, the fact that we are so diverse, economically, class, all of that, right? And at the same time, that not making assumption that we all are actually headed in the same political direction, because we are not. And I think, how do we provide resources within our own families, within our own networks, so that we can actually confront what that is? You know, the other thing I'll say is, this is where I think people on the other side, you know, I'm undocumented, I can't vote, right? And I think the journalist in me is always like, I'm an independent, I'm not a Republican or a Democrat. But I can tell you that the Republican Party is getting really specific about their audiences. We were just looking at a tweet about the fact that in the Virginia governor's race, the Republican candidate actually had literature in Korean and Vietnamese and other people's languages, while the Democratic candidate sent it in English, right? Like, that is the kind of how specific we need to get. And I don't think we can, I think we have to stop pretending that just because we're people of color, we're all progressive, and that we're all on the same side, because we're not. So this is where I think the narratives that we consume and how uncomfortable we are within our own, how comfortable we're willing to talk to our own relatives and friends about this, that's where the real work has to happen. So when I tell people, I'm glad you're on Twitter, I'm glad you're canceling people out on social media, but have you talked to your racist aunt? Talk to her. Because otherwise, you know who's gonna get to her? Someone on Fox, or some YouTube video that she saw, or some TV show, right?
So I think one of the things to take away from this is, there's a lot of creative solutions in the community, and we can go macro and be like, let's vote or let's do this, but that's not enough. It's not just about voting, it's about knowing who our communities are. It's about finding where they are and finding the things that are emotional enough that bring people together. We need to do much more to bring people together, because there's a lot out there bringing us apart or trying to tear us apart. And it's easy to fall into the trap of wanting to do more of tearing apart and blaming somebody else for something, or saying somebody else said something and therefore I should respond. The hard work, and frankly the more hopeful work, is the belonging piece. How do we actually create the country we want to live in, not the country we might see around us? But that's just hard. And it's gonna take all of us, Pan-Asian, with the white community, with the Black community, with the Latino community, with the LGBT community, to come together to do this, because it is the country we need to create. And I will just pose and argue that what the US does, the rest of the world watches. And I think it's incumbent upon any of us and all of us. I'm so grateful for our students who are here, who are in 8th grade. Because honestly, you're gonna have to lead us, and we're looking forward to it. And I think it's a responsibility of all of us. It's not the government's responsibility, it's not the politicians' responsibility, it's not the organization's responsibility. Each of us has a part to take in this. So I am so grateful for all of the work, Julia, that you are doing every day at the Asian Health Services. Christine, for the art that you're putting out there that is getting us to pay attention and for keeping us motivated. And Jose, every day for your stories and everything you're doing to speak up, but reminding us that we have a lot of work to do. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for the Asian Art Museum. Really appreciate everything you're doing. And thank you for partnering with us.
Thank you.